We can see our 3 dimensions here, and then if we go over to the periodic table of history, we can see our time axis. And we know that Adam is up here. We have the flood of Noah after Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and I'll zoom in here so we can see them. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's our starting point, and our linkage are those 4 couples. So flood of Noah, we've gone over the linkage between the Greeks, the Romans, and the Britons, and what we're going to do is get in here and talk about the British people from about where Brutus is down to Cymbeline, which is about the time of Jesus. Okay, so we're going to zoom in here to Brutus. I'm just really interested in the picture of history because it gives me a really good idea of the aspect of time and geography and where we came from, which I think where we came from is one of the most fascinating questions that we could ask, and everybody asks it at some time. So here in the history of the kings of Britain, we have Brutus dividing the territory upon his death. Brutus is said to have made the divisions among the British Isle. So here we can read and hear Camber had that part which lies beyond the river Severn, now called Wales, but which was for a long time named Cambria, and hence that people still call themselves in their British tongue Cambry. So we go a little farther and we can talk about Mempricius. He was eaten by wolves, which I think is a really bad way to go. According to the history of the kings of Britain, that's the way he went. And that's during the time of Saul. Possible dates for Saul, 1052, 1012 BC. I think the dates in Israel get a lot better after Solomon, which is about like 970. Like, I'll go in there. Yeah, so the dates get really solid right here. Anything before this time start getting a few years off this way or that way, so I don't worry about them. Academia is still fighting fiercely over everything beyond that point, about 1000 BC. So yeah, Mempricius does check out as to the time of Saul and David. Got eaten by wolves. Bad way to go. Okay, so here's Ebraucus. He sacked Gaul. And I could just say a little bit of word on Gaul. You can see the proximity of the British to what we now think of as France. And to me, it seems like there is a connection between Gaul and the Celts and Gaul, and then there's a language up here called Gallic, and it's like an older Welsh dialect. And there's a great relationship between the Celts, the British, and then most of the artifacts of the Celts are found really in France. And so that makes me think conquest has blurred the lines between what a Celt is, what a British person is, what an ancient British person was, and then what the Gauls were. But there was some such British attacking Gaul, and so there's the Gallic conquest. And we don't really know much about this. We just know that Ebraucus sacked Gaul. And on the subject of the Gauls, Commentary de Bello Gallica from Julius Caesar wrote about the Celts, and he has this to say. He says, all Gaul was divided into 3 parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, the Aquitani another, and those in their own language are called Celts, in our Gauls. And so you can see the vantage point that Julius Caesar was writing from, an Italian from Rome. He sees the major obstacle to him are the Gauls, who have this mountain range up here on the west side and a lot of fertile land over here. So according to Julius Caesar, and remember Julius Caesar lived in about 50 BC, you see him show up over here. So I'll zoom in here, Julius Caesar. So that is about 1,000 years later, so you have to take that into account when you think about it. But he's doing a commentary trying to find out what he can find, and he says they call themselves the Celts, we call them the Gauls. And it's funny, recommend this book quite a bit. It's called the Commentary de Bello Gallica, and you can see Julius Caesar going on. It's a very readable book, very common sense. You can see the brilliance of Julius Caesar, and it's funny to see these little pot shots that he shows in here. Like here it says, of all these civilizations, talking about Aquitani, the Gauls, or the Belgae. The Belgae are the bravest, because they are furthest from the civilization and refinement of our province. It's funny that Julius Caesar just brings up these kind of quirky details, and it's fun to think of it happening 2,000 years ago. Another connection that Julius Caesar makes is with the Druids, and he talks a lot about, you know, how they did human sacrifices and this, that, and the other, sometimes sacrificing animals, believed in reincarnation. Something that to me is really interesting is he starts talking about, okay, it's a separate class. They don't go to war. They're kind of a scholarly class, and they use Greek characters. That's fun to me when I think about whether I should put any validation in the history of the kings of the Britons or not. And then it says they're from Greek, so then do they use Greek? And then according to Julius Caesar, he says, yes, they use Greek characters. And he does this because a lot of the people do not read, and so they either don't write things down, so the Druids can keep their secrets hidden, or else they use Greek characters, and most people don't read. Interesting idea. And then another thing that Julius Caesar talks about is that this institution of the Druids is supposed to have been devised in Britain and to have been brought over from it into Gaul. And so they're again thinking of Julius Caesar's time, looking back 1,000 years, according to histories and traditions and things that a general will have heard in his conquest. There's this Druid Celt connection and a Celtic British connection, and the Gaul and the Celts are the same people. So there we see the Ebraucus sacked Gaul, and of course by proximity that would be either the Germans or the French, right? That's who's there. We do the most damage to our neighbors, but we don't have to. It's just that's what has historically happened. Brutus Greenshield, fun name. They just distinguish him between Brutus II, Greenshield, and the regular Brutus who established Britain. So Greenshield is said to have a green shield until he was at war and got his shield all bloody and turned red. Here, Hudibras, he was around during the time of Haggai, Amos, and Joel. I find that interesting because I've studied Hebrew history quite a bit, and then when I connect up the Hebrew history with the other histories, everything really starts making sense. This guy, Bledud, he's a fun guy because he was into necromancy, and he thought he could fly, so he thought he could conjure up the dead, and the dead would tell him things of how he could make machines so that he could fly. And so he messed up. I guess the dead people didn't tell him well enough how to fly, and so he was trying to fly, but fell down and hit a wall. So you see these colorful characters all throughout this British history, and well, you know, it does give a kind of a fun flavor to think about the Wright brothers in North Carolina that they were trying to fly to. They weren't using necromancy, so yeah, I don't recommend necromancy for doing that. And Lear, okay, Lear, there was a Shakespeare play. I hear that Shakespeare is being canceled, but that makes sense because they can't have any connection to the Bible, because you can see how close this is. You go back to the play of King Lear, and then you get back to Brutus, and then you have this connection with Rome, Greece, and the Bible. They don't want any of that. You know, that is just completely off limits to the academic group. So I can see how they would not really want Shakespeare to be taught. But I think Shakespeare is one of the most fascinating people, not the most moral or anything, and his plays are not necessarily moral, but they do show the human condition. We have so much richness in the storytelling, And Shakespeare was a guy that came along maybe once every 1,000 or 2,000 years. Incredible genius. He's actually so smart that most people can't get their comprehension up to where his comprehension is. And so if you want your IQ to go up, definitely get into Shakespeare, contraire to what the academic block wants you to have happen to you. They want you to be stupider and stupider. I don't know why. I'd rather people be smarter and smarter. I think that's a much better proposition because we can overcome our problems a whole lot better. So King Lear, it's a fun one. King Lear goes insane over his 3 daughters. His 3 daughters are fighting for the share in the kingdom. And okay, we can look a little bit farther and we can see that Cordelia is the one that wins. But he wants his daughters to kiss up to him and tell King Lear how great of a king he is. And he has one daughter that loves him a lot, Cordelia, and the other 2 that really hate him. But the 2 that hate him tell him all these really nice, fun things. And Cordelia says, my life is my love. You know that I love you because of my life. And so she won't kiss up to him, so he gets mad at her. See this idea of we hurt the people that are next to us? It's unbelievable. So King Lear divides his land up between the 2 daughters that hate him, but the 2 daughters that they also kissed up to him and lied about their love towards him. That triggers a civil war over here in the mainland of Britain, pushes Cordelia out to France or the Celts or the Gauls. She has a couple of suitors. One of them does not want her after she doesn't have her dowry of the kingdom. But Cordelia does marry into the French line. And then while there's this civil war going on in Britain, Cordelia is down here with an army. Anyway, there's that the armies clash, so on and so forth. Cordelia ends up the one that's the winner in England. But you can get to know Cordelia by the play King Lear, and that's a good one that talks about the human condition. Remember in Luke 12, Jesus said, take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. We are too caught up in these kind of things. And Shakespeare captures that. He captures that multiple times, really. So about Cordelia, if you're interested in her, just look up that Shakespeare play, and you can see the British, Celt, and Frankish connection. Go down, down, down. Okay, here was a plague. This is rather interesting. What's the plague? This plague of a rain of blood. Because we can read in the history of the kings of Britain, in his time it rained blood 3 days together, and there fell vast swarms of flies, followed by a great mortality among the people. And so it's been wondered, what is this? A complete skeptic would just say, no, it doesn't really exist. It can't rain blood. So that's the scholarly idea of it. Anybody looking for a scientific explanation, they found the Trentapolia annulata. They have this bacteria that if they're around the rain, then they're breathing this bacteria into their lungs. The bacteria is getting over all the plants. The flies are just going crazy. Really nasty time. So it isn't a real thing, and it has a scientific explanation. Okay, we zoom out here, and you can see this civil war happening right there. You can see how there's if we look along this line, we can see a long flat line, and then we see it split out. Whenever that happens, there's a civil war going on. We see the same thing happening over here in the United States with the Civil War of Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. People will go on just like they always do, and then boom, civil war happens, 2 power bases instead of 1. So it splits off like that. Same thing happens up here with Ferrex and Porrex. Gorboduc have a problem with covetousness. It's just something that comes up over and over and over again. So we have this war. Porrex attempts to assassinate Ferrex, and Ferrex goes to France. So there's that French and English connection again, or the Celt-British connection. Ferrex with Suhardus fought against Porrex, but Porrex is victorious. But their mother is not very happy with this, and so mother kills Porrex. But that launches a civil war, and we don't have a lot of information on this just because it is so brutal that we don't even have the names of the kings, just that there were 5 kings and they fought for a good long time, and their descendants. That would be in between the time the northern kingdom of Israel fell apart. See, there's the northern kingdom of Israel, and then we go over here, the southern kingdom of Israel. We'd have Manasseh, Josiah. So right in there, that's probably the time when things really fell apart for Britain. When things go back together, they are mended by Donvalo Molmutius. He creates the Malmutine laws. And have you ever heard of a barley corn? Well, 3 barley corns equal 1 inch. And 3 palms equal 1 foot. And 3 paces equals 1 leap. So those are standardized measurements according to Donvalo back in 420 BC. Belinus and Brenius, they're not happy with each other, but they also start thinking that if instead of attacking each other, they might be able to attack an external force. So we're back to this British and Gallic connection. They invade the Gauls. And with that army, they have a pretty powerful army, because the way they did is they would take captives, make slaves of some people, and sometimes they could get the other army to be in servitude to them. So that might even double their army size. And so they have a British Gallic army that also gets the Franks to submit to them. So now they have an absolutely huge army, and they decide they can make an attack on the Italians. So you can hear about the Gallic sack of Rome or the Celtic sack of Rome. It's the same thing, and it's Rome looking at this and thinking that it's just Gaul coming out to get them. And in those days, the 2 consuls of Rome were Gabius and Porcina, to whose care the government of the country was committed, talking about Rome. When they saw that no nation was able to withstand the power of Belinus and Brenius, they came with the consent of the Senate to them to desire peace and amity. They likewise offered large presents of gold and silver and pay yearly tribute on condition that they might be suffered to enjoy their own in peace. So you can see that idea of the 2 kings therefore taking hostages of them, yielded to their petition and drew back their forces into Germany. So though Rome was not really that friendly to Gaul and Germany before, now the Romans have a real reason not to like their neighbors. You think of World War I, World War II, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just the same game over and over again. If you can't forgive and you can't repent, then you have the same problems developing throughout. That'd be Belinus and Brenius. And then Morvidus, this guy's kind of interesting. There's one little blurb written about him. It turns out he's a pretty bad guy. He likes watching people die. So he waged war, killed a bunch of people, but then he liked having the captives brought out and watching them die. And you can see down here in the text, when he grew tired of this, he gave orders that they should be flayed alive and burned. And during these and other monstrous acts of cruelty, an accident happened by which put a period to his wickedness. Here's a fun one that we young earth creationists like. It's, there came from the coast of the Irish Sea a most cruel monster that was continually devouring the people upon the seacoasts. As soon as he heard of it, he ventured to go and encounter it alone. And when he had in vain spent all his darts upon it, the monster rushed upon him, and with open jaws swallowed him up like a small fish. So We young Earth creationists like that because we don't make a distinction between the dragons, the sea serpents, and the dinosaurs. So we'll go along and we'll get to Julius Caesar, and you can see a couple characters here. You have Cassivellaunus, and then we also have Julius Caesar. Big figure. I mean, this is where a lot of history comes together. He wrote the Commentary de Bello Gallico, and you can see that after all these wars, Romans are not real thrilled with the Gauls, so they are bent on taking Gaul and open up this whole area for themselves instead of having this barrier and having periodic sacks of Rome. So Julius Caesar wages war for quite a few years, and he writes that all in his commentary, and it's where we get a lot of information. So this is a great book to read. This is an amazing book to read, really. Well, we've read a little bit from it before, and we can look at it here. When he gets a little bit farther north, he encounters the Belgae, and we can see how he just fights, wins a war. The group of leaders from that area will come to him, and then there is a contract written up. And usually the contract ends up something like this. You can see here that preeminent in the number of its population, Julius Caesar demanded 600 hostages from Belgae. And when these were delivered and all the arms in the town collected, he went from that place into the territories of Ambiani. So you can see this idea of taking hostages and also disarming the people. And that creates a power vacuum because now you have the ability for the other kingdoms, like the Franks will now move in there knowing that the Belgae don't have any arms. So then in the contract, Julius Caesar will say, no, I'll protect you. But Caesar isn't the kind of person that really cares about protecting these conquered kingdoms. And so in the end of it, whoever gets conquered is just wide open to get slaughtered. And that's what ends up happening over and over again. Julius Caesar is the victor, so he's just writing about these people, and he's thinking, wow, these people are mad at me. But, so he writes here, to this was added that they were indignant that their children were torn from them under the title of hostages. You see these snippets that are so fun. I mean, there's just no empathy for the loser in these kind of ordeals. I mean, the people really would be indignant. He's watching them be indignant, but he doesn't care at all. He's just going to go conquer the next people. And it's so fun. Look at this quotation. It says, "For what purpose was so vast a machine constructed at so great a distance? With what hands or with what strength did they, especially as they were men of such very small stature?" So Julius Caesar is talking about the Belgians and how they're mad at the Italians because the Belgians are saying the Italians are shorter than them, but they're still winning the war, so the Belgians are not happy with this. But all in all, people do what they do after they find out that they don't want to be slaves and they're tired of their kids being torn off and taken to Rome, and their villages got burned down, and they've also been told that they have to provide corn to Caesar. Then they run away. So they run off to Britain. So you see this, that the Belgians now fled into Britain. So we're doing this whole conquest. This triggers, now that Julius Caesar has nobody standing in his way, conquers this whole land, Gaul, Aquitania, the Celto-British, he does a naval war, and the Belgae. So then he cites the British, and that's where we come to this. That's why this timeline is coming together, because you see the Cassivellaunus here and Julius Caesar. So Cassivellaunus has a couple different spellings, but he comes up in Welsh literature, comes up in the Anglo-Saxon literature, the history of the kings of Britain, so British literature, and then also Roman literature. So you can see the technology is just getting greater so that armies can go a greater distance. And so Julius Caesar, being the great general that he is, he goes farther. You don't have to worry about the people until the technology gets greater. And then, lo and behold, enemy from Italy is now on the doorstep of Britain. Here's the Julius Caesar writing in in Latin, and he has the name Casavellano. And if you go back to the English, you can read this, and of course, at any time you can pause these and then read them. But I just think it's fun to see the crossover of Casavellanus from the Roman perspective, and then look over into the British perspective and see the historicity of it. Because for me, I'm wondering about the validity of everything. You know, can I trust an account? And so when there's more weight to an account, then I can trust it more. And there's more observers talking about the same event. So in the history of the kings of Britain, you have the British looking at what the Romans said to them. And you can see and hear that when Julius Caesar crosses over, it said here, then fixing his eyes upon the ocean, as soon as he was informed of the name of the kingdom of the people, he said, in truth, we Romans and the Britons have the same origin, since both are descended from the Trojan race. Our father, after the destruction of Troy, was Aeneas. There's Brutus, whose father was Silvanus, the son of Ascanius, the son of Aeneas. But I am deceived if they are not very much degenerated from us, and know nothing of the art of war, since they live separated by the ocean from the whole world. They may be easily forced to become our tributaries and subjects to the Roman state. So there's the British take, looking at the Romans coming into Britain. The Anglo-Saxons also talked about this. Then took the Welsh sharp piles and drove them with great clubs into the water at a certain ford in the river called Thames. When the Romans found that they would not go over the ford, then fled the Britons to the fastness of the woods, and Caesar, having much fighting, gained many of the chief towns, went back into Gaul. So that's the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, and remember the Anglo-Saxons are over here, haven't invaded, and then they researched the history. And that's what the Anglo-Saxons came up in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So they're looking at this same thing. And that's kind of interesting to see that idea of going in here into the Thames, that Julius Caesar came up here and had to encounter these naval blockades. See, Nennius talks about this in the Historia Britonum. So the Romans were therefore a third time sent against the Britons, and under the command of Julius defeated them near the place called Trinovantum. So this is a try again kind of a scenario with Julius Caesar trying to conquer Britain. And we have various accounts of this. In Julius Caesar's own words, he says, he himself, having advanced by night about 12 miles, espied the forces of the enemy. They, advancing to the river with their cavalry and chariots from the higher ground, began to annoy our men and give battle. Being repulsed by our cavalry, they concealed themselves in woods, as they had secured a place admirably fortified by nature and by art, which, as it seemed, they had before prepared on account of a civil war. For all entrances to it were shut up by a great number of felled trees. They themselves rushed out of the woods to fight here and there, and prevented our men from entering their fortifications. But the soldiers of the 7th Legion, having formed a testudo and thrown up a rampart against the fortification, took the place and drove them out of the woods, receiving only a few wounds. So you can see the tactics here. The British are using the guerrilla warfare tactics and the woods to their advantage, and Caesar just has this mighty army that'll put up a bunch of shields and work themselves into a formation where they're not getting hit by arrows, and they're just marching, taking over land. Well-trained army. It's so funny to see here. They before prepared on account of a civil war. I mean, you just see the British completely fighting each other all the time. It's just one castle against another castle all day long. Yeah, Julius Caesar writes here, it's just great to see Julius Caesar's words here confirming all this. When he had come thither, greater forces of the Britons had already assembled at that place. The chief command and management of the war having been entrusted to Casavellanus, whose territories a river, which is called the Thames, separates from the maritime states at about 80 miles from the sea. He says, they were greatly alarmed by our arrival. Yeah, I think so. And you see this account where you see this Julius Caesar arriving close to London. He says when he arrived there, he perceives that the numerous forces of the enemy were marshaled at the other banks of the river. The bank also was defended by sharp stakes fixed in front, and stakes of the same kind fixed under the water were covered by the river. So good thinking on the part of the British, but just not good enough. So Cassivellaunus ends up falling, Britain ends up falling. There's not a really clear good governorship of the Romans taking over governorship. It's just more they conquered the army, and then Julius Caesar's goal was to conquer Gaul, so he has to go back and work with the affairs over there. So it's real fun to see that Julius Caesar conquers into Gaul and then turns back, comes down here, and then he says this statement. Isn't this funny? Ships having been drawn up in general assembly of the Gauls held at Samarabriva, because the corn that year had not prospered in Gaul by reason of the droughts. I think that's really funny. Caesar just goes through this whole area, slaughters all these people, carries off slaves, slaughters the men of war, burns down the farms. Everything is going crazy. The Germans, who are the Franks, they start coming in, just attacking, stealing what they can from the people. The people are just wasted in Gaul. People are wasted up in the British. He comes back here, and then he says, oh, there was a drought. And he says, oh, the corn that year had not prospered by reason of the drought. Didn't have anything to do with Julius Caesar, So that is so funny. So this was not a time, we look for a time of peace or whatever. I mean, we're more in a time of peace now than we've ever been in the world. It's just war after war after war, and not pretty sights. I mean, when you talk about Rome, here's one. Julius Caesar saying he marched himself to depopulate the country. Hey, let's depopulate them. Let's depopulate those guys. It's like, wow. I mean, if you were not tough, you could not live in this land. The thinking was conquer or be conquered. So those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So when Julius Caesar goes back to Rome, what happens? He gets assassinated. And we have another one of English Shakespeare's plays called Julius Caesar. So you had Brutus and the rest of the gang stabbing Julius Caesar because they were afraid of the power that he had acquired. And so you have Caesar's ghost appearing unto Brutus in the painting. So think of this time right here. I can put a little circle on that. That's a particular time that shaped history. Incredible. We'll skip down here to Cymbeline. So this is where we'll end up with. There's a Welsh manuscript called the Harleian Genealogies that confirms Cymbeline. So there is that writing. We have the history of the kings of Britain, and Shakespeare writes Cymbeline. This time is particularly important, and I think it's significant because look at that, 18 BC to 12 AD. 18 BC to 12 AD, very significant because that is the time of Jesus. So we can zoom in here to Jesus, and he's the one that split time in two. And just amazing to see things were going on in the world at the same time Jesus was on this world. So if you ever think about checking out Cymbeline from your local library, Shakespeare play, and you're watching it, you can think that if you're over here in Britain, you can think, well, what was going on in Israel? And you can think, oh, Jesus was walking back and forth over here at that same time. And that is just something that sparks my imagination. It just really sets me off to see what's going on. Because I was always curious, like, what else is going on? What else is going on? Aren't there other things happening in the world? Well, yes, there are. So just think, that tumultuous time of Julius Caesar conquering over here in Europe and just setting this place on fire happened just before Jesus. But then, of course, after Jesus had his disciples. His disciples went along all these roads that Rome put into play all around the Mediterranean. So Rome's conquest of this area opened up the whole land. And that's one of the reasons why Christianity was so flourishing. It had the ability to move from place to place to place along these Roman roads. Yeah, so that was that time period. We could say from Brutus to Cymbeline, which is about 1100 BC to the time of Jesus Christ. Really fascinating history in there. And to study that more fully, you just go into the Bible, then go into the genealogies of Josephus, get down here into Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the connections of the genealogies that go back from, I guess you could go into Eusebius, and that gives you the genealogies there. Go to the Trojan War, so you can read the Iliad. When you get into Rome, you can read the Metamorphoses by Ovid, Brute Chronicles, and the kings of Britain get you into Britain. You go through all this. Ananias has a little bit on this, and then get into Julius Caesar, and now we're talking about full-blown history like we know it today, with people line by line documenting their works. So I encourage people to read those books to get into the biblical idea of history. So remember, we don't have to be caught up in this endless cycle of destruction. We can learn from history. So I have links to the books down in the box below. I hope the best for you. It's going to be a good week. Hope the best for you in your week. Remember, in 2 days, tomorrow will be yesterday. So remember to help the people that you can today, and I'll see you next time.